Imagine a place where the sheriff is more likely to rob you than protect you, where judges sell verdicts to the highest bidder, where the richest man in town made his fortune by cheating minors out of their claims and bribing officials to look the other way, where laws exist on paper but mean absolutely nothing because everyone with power is too busy getting rich to enforce them. That wasn't some corrupt dictatorship in a distant land. That was California in the 1850s and 60s. And here's what nobody tells you about the golden age of the gold rush. It wasn't law that determined who succeeded and who failed. It wasn't hard work or talent or even luck. It was greed. Pure, unrestrained, shameless greed. The people who got rich in early California weren't the ones who followed the rules. They were the ones who wrote the rules to enrich themselves. They were the ones who bribed officials, manipulated courts, monopolized resources, and crushed anyone who stood in their way. They turned government into a tool for personal profit. They made law enforcement a joke. They created a system where the only thing that mattered was how much you were willing to steal and who you were willing to destroy to get it. This wasn't capitalism. This wasn't democracy. This was oligarchy dressed up in American flags and constitutional language. It was a place where greed determined everything: who owned land, who got justice, who lived, and who died. The law existed, technically. There were courts and sheriffs and legislatures, but they were all for sale and everyone knew it. The honest miners who believed hard work would be rewarded, they died poor. The merchants who charged fair prices, they went bankrupt. The officials who tried to enforce laws honestly, they were threatened, bribed, or removed. Because in early California, greed wasn't just rewarded, it was the system. It was how things worked. It was the invisible hand that actually controlled everything while law was just window dressing for the corrupt. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand exactly how greed, not law, ran early California. You'll see the specific mechanisms through which corrupt officials, greedy businessmen, and ruthless land grabbers turned government into their personal wealth extraction machine. And you'll understand why the people who built their fortunes in early California did it not through honest enterprise, but through systematic corruption that made a mockery of every principle America claimed to stand for. To understand how greed came to control California, you need to understand the perfect storm of conditions that made corruption inevitable and law enforcement impossible. January 1848, gold is discovered at Sutter's mill. Within months, word spreads globally. By 1849, over 100,000 people are flooding into California from every corner of the world. By 1852, the population exceeds 250,000. This is the fastest mass migration in American history, and it's driven entirely by one thing: the desire to get rich quick. Here's why that mattered. These people didn't come to build a society. They came to grab gold and leave. Nobody was thinking long-term. Nobody cared about creating stable institutions or fair systems. Everyone was focused on extracting maximum wealth in minimum time and then getting out. That mindset, temporary, extractive, purely mercenary, poisoned everything. California in 1848 existed in a legal vacuum that made corruption inevitable. It had just been seized from Mexico through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexican law technically no longer applied. American law hadn't been established yet. California wasn't even a state. It was a territory with unclear legal status and virtually no federal oversight. The federal government was 3,000 miles away across terrain that took months to cross. There was no way for Washington to monitor what was happening in California, let alone control it. The few federal officials sent to California were overwhelmed, underpaid, and usually just as corrupt as everyone else. Federal authority was theoretical, not practical. California didn't become a state until 1850, and even then, statehood was largely meaningless in terms of actual governance. The state government had no enforcement capacity. It couldn't project power across the enormous territory. It couldn't pay officials adequately. It couldn't prevent corruption. It was government in name only. Into this vacuum of authority came 250,000 people competing for limited gold deposits. And here's the critical detail. The gold was on public land with no clear ownership rules. Who owned mining claims? How were they established and protected? What happened when claims conflicted? There were no clear answers, no established legal framework, no authority capable of enforcing whatever rules did exist. The Spanish and Mexican land grants added another layer of legal chaos and opportunity for greed. When California became American territory, thousands of land grants issued by the Spanish and Mexican governments were theoretically still valid. Approving ownership required navigating a corrupt legal system that strongly favored American squatters over legitimate Mexican landowners. The Land Commission, established in 1851 to adjudicate these claims, became a vehicle for systematic theft. The process was designed to bankrupt legitimate landowners through endless legal fees and delays while American speculators grabbed the land. The greed wasn't subtle. It was systematic legal theft enabled by government institutions. The geography made law enforcement essentially impossible. California is enormous, over 160,000 square miles of mountains, deserts, valleys, and coastline. The mining camps were scattered across hundreds of miles of remote, difficult terrain. Even if you wanted to enforce law consistently, you couldn't. The territory was too big, too wild, too disconnected. This meant that local power was everything. In each mining camp, in each town, in each county, whoever had local power could do whatever they wanted. There was no higher authority that could or would intervene. That created perfect conditions for greed to flourish because there was no accountability. The population composition made things worse. Early California was overwhelmingly young men with no families, no long-term stakes in the community, no reason to care about building fair institutions. They were transient fortune seekers who'd be gone in months or years. Why would they build stable, honest systems when they weren't planning to stick around? The few people who did have long-term plans were the ones who realized that real wealth came not from mining gold, but from controlling the systems through which gold flowed. The merchants who sold supplies, the bankers who controlled credit, the land speculators who grabbed property, the politicians who wrote laws to enrich themselves. These people understood that greed worked best when you controlled the rules. And they did control the rules because there was no power to stop them. No free press to expose them. No federal oversight to constrain them. No educated, engaged citizenry to vote them out. No legal system that functioned independently of wealth and power. This was the setup. A massive territory with unclear laws, no effective enforcement, transient population focused on quick wealth extraction, enormous resources up for grabs, and no authority capable of preventing the powerful from simply taking whatever they wanted. It was a system perfectly designed for greed to triumph over law, and that's exactly what happened. The daily reality of life in early California showed how greed infected even the most basic aspects of survival, turning necessities into profit opportunities for the unscrupulous. You needed a place to sleep. In a society run by law, there'd be property rights, fair pricing, and regulation to prevent exploitation. In early California, housing was controlled by greed. In San Francisco, landlords charged outrageous rents because they could. A space on the floor of a boarding house, not a bed, just floor space, could cost $10 per night, roughly $300 in today's money. The landlords weren't providing good housing. They were exploiting scarcity. Buildings were thrown up in days, wooden fire traps with no safety features, no sanitation, no quality. But they charged premium prices anyway because what were you going to do? Sleep in the street. The greed was shameless, and there was no regulation to stop it. In mining camps, land ownership was a joke determined by who could defend it. You'd stake a claim to a camp spot, build a tent, and hope nobody with more guns decided they wanted your location. There was no city planning, no zoning, no authority managing land use fairly. It was just whoever grabbed it first and could hold it through force or intimidation. Water, the most basic necessity became a greed-driven monopoly in many areas. In San Francisco, water companies charged extortionate rates for contaminated water. They had local monopolies and used them to price gouge. There was no regulation of pricing, no quality standards, no recourse if you were being robbed. In the mining districts, it was worse. Water was essential for mining, so whoever controlled water sources controlled wealth. People diverted streams, built dams, and sold water at criminal markups. The hydraulic mining companies monopolized water through sheer scale and capital, then charged whatever they wanted. There should have been public regulation of water as a common resource essential for life. Instead, greed privatized and monopolized it. And the government, such as it existed, did nothing because the people monopolizing water were often the same people running the government. Food prices were manipulated by merchant cartels operating without competition or regulation. In the early 1850s, a handful of merchants controlled most of the food supply in California. They de-coordinate pricing, hoard goods to create artificial scarcity, and charge whatever desperate miners would pay. A single egg could cost $1, about $30 today. A pound of flour could cost $4, $120 today. These weren't market prices reflecting actual scarcity. They were manipulated prices created by merchants colluding to extract maximum profit. And there was no antitrust enforcement, no price controls, no government action to prevent this exploitation. The merchants justified it as free market capitalism. Actually, it was market manipulation and monopolistic practice, exactly the kind of thing that functioning governments regulate to prevent. But California's government didn't regulate it because the merchants had bought off officials or were officials themselves. The food was often adulterated to increase profits. Merchants would mix sawdust into flour, water down whiskey, sell spoiled meat as fresh. There were no health inspections, no quality standards, no penalties for poisoning customers. Greed determined that selling garbage at premium prices was more profitable than selling quality, and there was no law to stop it. Firewood and fuel became monopolized and price fixed. In cities and mining camps, you needed fuel for heating and cooking. Entrepreneurs would monopolize firewood supplies through contracts or intimidation, then charge outrageous prices. A cord of wood that cost $5 to harvest might sell for $50. This was pure rent-seeking, adding no value, just inserting yourself between supply and demand and extracting profit through market power. In a law-based society, this gets regulated. In greed-based California, it was standard business practice. Clothing and basic goods were similarly manipulated. Merchants would buy up entire shipments, creating local monopolies, then charge whatever they wanted. A simple pair of boots could cost $50, $1,500 today. Work shirts cost $6, $180 today. These weren't prices reflecting true scarcity. They were greed-inflated prices enabled by lack of competition and regulation. The government could have intervened. It could have prevented monopolies, enforced fair trading, regulated prices on essentials, ensured quality standards. It did none of this because the people running government were the same people profiting from the exploitation or were being paid by them. Even mail service was corrupt. The postal system was supposed to be a public service, but postal workers would hold mail hostage until you paid extra fees. Letters from home describing family emergencies. Pay up or you don't get them. The official postal rates were one thing. The actual cost of getting your mail was whatever corrupt postal workers demanded. This wasn't isolated graft, it was systematic. Every basic necessity was an opportunity for someone to exploit you, and there was no law to prevent it because greed, not law, determined how things worked. The daily survival reality proved the title. You weren't navigating a system of laws and regulations designed to create fair markets and protect consumers. You were navigating a system of greed where every necessity was controlled by someone trying to extract maximum profit with minimum concern for fairness, quality, or your survival. The people who succeeded weren't the ones who provided the best value. They were the ones willing to monopolize, price gouge, adulterate products, and bribe officials to look the other way. That's not a market economy regulated by law. That's a greed economy where law is irrelevant. The economic systems that emerged in early California proved definitively that greed, not law, determined who got rich and who got crushed. Let me show you exactly how this worked. Mining claims were supposed to be regulated by law. In theory, there was a system. You'd stake a claim, register it, and have legal ownership that courts would protect. In practice, the system was controlled by whoever had the most money and the most willingness to corrupt it. Large mining operations with capital would use the legal system to steal claims from individual miners. They'd de-challenge ownership through corrupt courts where judges were paid off. They'd use lawyers the individual miners couldn't afford. They'd drag out legal proceedings until the miner went bankrupt from legal fees and had to abandon the claim. This wasn't about who had the better legal case. It was about who could afford to manipulate the legal system longer. The law became a weapon that greed used to take from those who couldn't fight back legally. Hydraulic mining companies exemplified greed over law perfectly. These operations would blast hillsides with high-pressure water, sending millions of tons of sediment into rivers. This destroyed farmland downstream, contaminated water supplies, caused flooding, and ruined the livelihoods of thousands of farmers. The farmers sued. They had clear legal cases. The hydraulic mining was causing demonstrable harm and should be stopped as a public nuisance. But the mining companies had money and political power. They bribed legislators, paid off judges, and delayed legal proceedings for decades while continuing to destroy the environment and people's livelihoods. It took until 1884, decades of legal battles, before hydraulic mining was finally restricted through the Sawyer decision. But by then, the damage was done. The mining companies had extracted their wealth, and the people harmed had suffered for decades because greed had prevented law from being enforced. The foreign miners' tax showed how law was written explicitly to serve greed through racial exploitation. In 1850, California passed a law requiring foreign miners to pay $20 per month for the privilege of mining, about $600 in today's money. This was aimed primarily at Chinese and Latin American miners. This wasn't about law and order or fair taxation. It was about using state power to extract wealth from vulnerable populations who couldn't vote or defend themselves politically. It was legal theft, and it generated enormous revenue for the state and for the tax collectors who kept a percentage. The tax collectors were often corrupt enforcers who'd rob Chinese miners, claim it was tax collection, and pocket the money. Chinese miners had no legal recourse because they couldn't testify against white people in court. The law created a system where greed could steal from the powerless with government backing. Banking in early California was a greed-driven casino with no regulation or oversight. Banks would open, accept deposits, then close overnight and disappear with depositors' money. There was no deposit insurance, no banking regulation, no capital requirements, no oversight. The Adams and Company Bank collapse in 1855 wiped out thousands of depositors. The bank had been run recklessly, making risky investments with depositors' money. When it failed, ordinary people lost their life savings while the bank owners escaped with much of the wealth. There were no consequences because there was no banking law that actually protected depositors. Legitimate bankers were outcompeted by fraudsters because operating honestly cost more than operating dishonestly. In a system run by law, regulation would have prevented this. In California's greed-run system, the honest lost and the corrupt thrived. Land speculation was perhaps the clearest example of greed triumphing over law. The Mexican land grants should have been protected by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which guaranteed property rights. Instead, the system was rigged to steal that land. The Land Commission required Mexican landowners to prove their ownership through American courts using American legal procedures in English. This was designed to bankrupt them. The legal process took years and cost fortunes in legal fees. Meanwhile, American squatters would occupy the land, and the courts would protect the squatters over the legal owners. Lawyers and speculators worked together to defraud legitimate landowners. They offer to help with the legal case, take ownership of portions of the land as payment, then deliberately lose the case and end up owning everything. It was systematic legal theft enabled by corrupt courts and laws designed to benefit Americans over Mexicans. The people who got rich from this weren't the ones with legitimate claims. They were the ones willing to manipulate the legal system to steal land. That's greed over law. Labor exploitation showed how greed determined working conditions in the absence of labor law. Workers had no protections, no safety regulations, no minimum wage, no recourse against abusive employers. The only thing that mattered was what employers could get away with. Chinese laborers building the Central Pacific Railroad were worked under conditions that amounted to slavery. They were paid less than white workers for more dangerous work. They were given the most hazardous jobs, setting explosives, working on cliff faces. Hundreds died, and the railroad companies didn't care because greed determined that worker lives were less valuable than construction speed and cost savings. There were no wrongful death lawsuits that succeeded, no safety investigations, no penalties for employers who killed workers through negligence. Law should have protected workers. Instead, greed determined that workers were disposable. Wage theft was rampant and unpunished. Employers would promise wages, then refuse to pay after work was completed. Workers could sue, but the courts were slow, expensive, and often corrupt. By the time you got a judgment, the employer might have disappeared or hidden assets. The legal system didn't protect workers because it was designed by and for employers. The economic system that emerged proved the title. Success wasn't determined by who followed laws, who worked hardest, or who created the most value. It was determined by who was willing to steal claims through corrupt courts, who could bribe officials to ignore environmental destruction, who could exploit racial minorities through discriminatory laws, who could defraud depositors and landowners, and who could work laborers to death without consequences. That's not an economy run by law. That's an economy run by greed, where law is just a tool the greedy use to legitimize theft. The public health catastrophe in early California showed how greed, not concern for human welfare or legal responsibility, determined who lived and died. Cholera epidemics swept through California repeatedly in the early 1850s, killing thousands. In a society run by law and public health principles, there would have been quarantines, water quality enforcement, sanitation standards, and coordinated medical response. In California, there was greed. Water companies continued selling contaminated water during cholera outbreaks because stopping sales would cost them money. They had no legal obligation to provide clean water, and there was no enforcement of water quality standards. Greed determined that profit from selling disease-carrying water was more important than public health. The cities and camps had no sanitation infrastructure because building it would cost money that nobody wanted to spend. Private property owners wouldn't pay for sewers. The government wouldn't pay either because officials were more interested in enriching themselves than providing public services. So human waste contaminated water supplies and cholera spread, killing thousands, because greed prevented basic public health measures. Doctors and medical providers operated without licensing or quality standards, creating opportunities for greedy quacks to profit from desperate sick people. Anyone could claim to be a doctor. Anyone could sell anything as medicine. There was no medical licensing board, no quality control, no legal consequences for medical fraud. Patent medicines filled with alcohol, opium, or literal poison were sold as cures for everything. The sellers knew these were worthless or harmful, but greed determined that separating sick people from their money was more important than actually healing them. The law could have regulated medical practice and drug sales. It didn't because the people selling snake oil had paid off the politicians. Real doctors complained about quacks destroying public health, but their complaints went nowhere because the quacks had money and political connections. Greed protected fraudulent medicine from legal regulation. Mining injuries and deaths demonstrated how greed prevented workplace safety law. Thousands of miners were killed or disabled in accidents that were preventable with basic safety measures. But safety measures cost money, and greed determined that saving money was more important than saving lives. Mine owners had no legal obligation to provide safe working conditions. When miners died in collapses, explosions, or from toxic exposure, the owners faced no consequences. There were no wrongful death lawsuits that succeeded against owners, no safety inspections, no penalties for negligence. This wasn't because safe mining was impossible. It was because implementing safety cost money, and there was no law forcing owners to do it. Greed determined that worker deaths were an acceptable cost of doing business. The mercury poisoning from mining operations showed greed poisoning entire populations without legal consequence. Mercury was used extensively in gold processing. It contaminated water supplies, poisoned fish, and caused neurological damage to thousands of people who consumed contaminated water and food. Everyone knew this was happening. The mercury poisoning was obvious and documented, but the mining companies had no legal obligation to prevent pollution, and enforcing environmental standards would have cost them money. So they continued poisoning water supplies for decades because greed determined that their profits were more important than public health. Injured workers were discarded without compensation because greed determined that was more profitable than providing support. If you were disabled in a mining accident, you were simply fired. There was no workers' compensation, no disability support, no legal obligation for employers to care for injured workers. You'd end up begging on the streets of San Francisco, a visible reminder of how greed discarded people when they were no longer profitable. The law could have required employers to compensate injured workers. It didn't because employers had more political power than workers. The mortality rate in early California was shockingly high. Estimates suggest up to 20% of Gold Rush participants died within a few years. These weren't unavoidable deaths. Many were preventable through basic public health measures, workplace safety, medical regulation, and environmental protection. But implementing those measures cost money and reduced profits. Greed determined that saving money was more important than saving lives. And law, which should have forced public health and safety measures, was absent or unenforced because greedy interests controlled government. The death toll proved the title. In a society run by law, public health is protected through sanitation requirements, water quality standards, medical licensing, workplace safety, and environmental regulation. In California, greed determined that all of those cost too much, so thousands died preventable deaths, while the people profiting from the unsafe conditions got rich and faced no consequences. The complete failure of law enforcement in early California proved definitively that greed, not law, controlled society. Let me show you the specific mechanisms through which this happened. Law enforcement was for sale to the highest bidder. Sheriffs and marshals were elected officials who needed campaign funding and could be bought. In San Francisco, the sheriff in the early 1850s was widely known to be corrupt. He'd protect criminals who paid him, ignore crimes by wealthy individuals, and even participate in criminal enterprises himself. This wasn't a secret. Everyone knew the sheriff was corrupt. But he stayed in office because he had wealthy backers who benefited from having a corrupt sheriff who'd protect their interests and ignore their crimes. Greed had purchased law enforcement. In mining camps, law enforcement was whoever had the most guns and the most willingness to use violence. There were no professional police. Justice was determined by armed groups, usually controlled by whoever had the most economic power in the camp. This meant that the wealthy could literally get away with murder, while the poor were punished harshly for minor offenses. The courts were systemically corrupt, with judges openly taking bribes. In land cases, Mexican landowners would lose to American squatters regardless of legal merit because the American squatters bribed the judges. In mining disputes, large companies would win against individual miners because they paid off the courts. There were documented cases of judges literally auctioning off verdicts. Whoever paid the most won the case. This wasn't occasional corruption. It was systematic. The legal system was a business, and justice was the product for sale. The greed wasn't subtle. Lawyers and judges would collude to drag out cases to generate legal fees, bankrupting litigants while enriching themselves. They'd file false claims, manufacture evidence, and commit perjury, all knowing there would be no consequences because everyone in the legal system was profiting from the corruption. Vigilante organizations emerged not to fight corruption, but to protect greedy interests when official corruption wasn't enough. The San Francisco Vigilance Committees are often portrayed as heroic citizens fighting crime. Actually, they were businessmen protecting their economic interests through extra-legal violence. The 1851 and 1856 Vigilance Committees were dominated by merchants and business owners who were frustrated that official corruption wasn't serving their interests fast enough. So they created their own parallel legal system where they could hang or exile anyone who threatened their profits, competitors, labor organizers, political opponents, or actual criminals who threatened business. This was greed using violence when legal corruption was insufficient. The vigilantes didn't restore law. They replaced one corrupt system with another that more directly served business interests. Land theft through legal manipulation was systematic and enormous in scale. The Act of 1851 required Mexican land grant holders to prove their claims before a land commission. This sounds fair until you understand it was designed to facilitate theft. The burden of proof was placed on the landowners, not the squatters. The proceedings were in English and required American legal representation, bankrupting non-English speakers. The process took an average of 17 years to resolve, during which squatters could occupy and use the land. Legal fees were enormous, often consuming the value of the land even if you won. This was legal theft by design. The law was written by greedy American speculators who wanted Mexican land. The courts implemented it to maximize American acquisition of Mexican property. The whole system was greed using law as a weapon to steal. Honest landowners who tried to defend their property legally were bankrupted by the process. Lawyers would take large portions of land as payment, then deliberately mismanage cases. By the time the legal process finished, the original owner had lost everything to legal fees, and American speculators owned what had been legitimate Mexican property. The foreign miners, tax enforcement was legalized robbery. Tax collectors would extort money from Chinese and other foreign miners, often collecting more than the legal tax and pocketing the difference. They'd use violence and threats, knowing Chinese miners had no legal recourse. This was greed using discriminatory law to enable theft. The tax itself was legal, but the enforcement was systematic robbery, and the government didn't care because it was receiving tax revenue and the victims couldn't vote or defend themselves politically. When Chinese miners tried to resist or seek legal protection, they were attacked by mobs, often with law enforcement participation or approval. The law wasn't protecting them from violence. It was enabling violence against them for economic gain. Murder was common and rarely punished because enforcing murder law cost money and there was no profit in it. The murder rate in early California was astronomical, possibly over 1,000 murders per year in the early 1850s. The vast majority were never investigated or prosecuted. Why? Because investigating murders costs money, and greed determined that government resources should be spent on things that generated revenue or served wealthy interests. Murder investigations and prosecutions did neither, so they were ignored unless the victim was wealthy or politically connected. You could literally get away with murder in early California if you had money or connections. The law against murder existed on paper, but greed determined that enforcing it wasn't profitable, so it wasn't enforced. The complete breakdown of law enforcement proved the title. In a society run by law, police are professional and accountable, courts are impartial, justice is blind to wealth, and laws are enforced consistently. In early California, police served whoever paid them, courts sold verdicts, justice favored the wealthy, and laws were enforced only when it profited someone. That's not law, that's greed in a legal costume. The treatment of vulnerable populations proved most starkly that greed, not law or justice, ran early California. These were the people who most needed legal protection and who received the least because protecting them wasn't profitable. Women had virtually no legal rights, and the absence of protection created opportunities for greed to exploit them systematically. Married women couldn't own property in their own names in most circumstances. They couldn't enter contracts. They couldn't sue. Their husbands controlled all marital assets. This wasn't about tradition, it was about greed. Keeping women legally powerless meant men could control their labor and property. A woman's inheritance, earnings, and assets all belonged to her husband, and she had no legal recourse. The law could have protected women's property rights. It didn't because men with power benefited from women's powerlessness. The trafficking of women into forced prostitution was systematic and barely illegal. Thousands of women, particularly Chinese women, were brought to California through fraud or outright kidnapping and forced into brothel slavery. This was known. It was obvious. It was documented. The law could have stopped it. Slavery was illegal. Kidnapping was illegal. Forced prostitution should have been prosecuted. But it wasn't because the greed of brothel owners, importers, and corrupt officials was more important than women's freedom. The brothel owners had political connections and paid bribes to police and officials to ignore the trafficking. The importers who brought women made enormous profits. The corrupt officials took payoffs. Everyone in the chain was profiting, so the law was ignored while women were enslaved. Women who tried to escape forced prostitution had no legal protection. If they went to police, they'd often be returned to their brothels because the police were paid by the brothel owners. The law against slavery and kidnapping existed on paper. Greed prevented its enforcement. Children had zero legal protections, creating opportunities for exploitation. There were no child labor laws, no compulsory education, no age restrictions on work, no protections against abuse or neglect. Children were economic assets to be exploited, and greed determined how they were treated. Orphans were particularly vulnerable. When parents died, which happened constantly, children were left alone with no social services to protect them. They'd be adopted by people who wanted unpaid labor. They'd be worked in dangerous jobs. Girls would be forced into prostitution. The law could have protected orphans. It didn't because there was no profit in it. The apprenticeship system in California legalized child slavery. The Act for the Government and Protection of Indians of 1850 allowed white people to take custody of Native American children and force them to work until adulthood. This was legal kidnapping and slavery, justified as apprenticeship. Greedy settlers would raid native villages, kidnap children, and force them to work as unpaid laborers. This was profitable, free labor until age 18 for boys, 15 for girls. The law authorized it. The people profiting from child slavery had written the law to make their greed legal. Chinese immigrants faced legal discrimination designed to enable their economic exploitation. They were required to pay the foreign miners' tax. They couldn't testify in court against white people, which meant white criminals could rob, assault, or murder Chinese people with impunity. They were excluded from many occupations and areas. This discrimination wasn't about prejudice alone, it was about greed. The foreign miners' tax generated revenue while eliminating Chinese competition for mining claims. The prohibition on testimony meant white people could rob Chinese people without legal consequences. The occupational restrictions protected white workers from competition. The law was written to serve white economic interests at the expense of Chinese immigrants. That's greed using law as a weapon of economic warfare. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the culmination of this greed-driven persecution. It banned Chinese immigration and prevented Chinese residents from becoming citizens. Why? Because white workers and their political representatives wanted to eliminate economic competition. This was greed, pure economic self-interest, using law to exclude an entire ethnicity for competitive advantage. It wasn't about law or justice or American values. It was about white workers wanting higher wages and less competition, so they used political power to legally ban their competitors. Mexican and California landowners were systematically robbed through legal mechanisms designed to transfer their property to Americans. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed their property rights. The California legal system was designed to nullify those guarantees. Squatter laws protected American settlers who illegally occupied Mexican land. The Land Commission required Mexican owners to prove ownership through expensive American legal proceedings. The whole system was designed to bankrupt legitimate Mexican landowners and transfer property to Americans. This was greed on a massive scale, the theft of millions of acres of land through legal mechanisms designed specifically to facilitate that theft. The people who got rich from this weren't the ones with legitimate claims. They were the ones who understood that law in California was a tool for greed, not justice. Native Californians faced genocide enabled by greedy settlers who wanted their land and their labor. The state government paid bounties for Native American scalps, literally paying for murder. Militias hunted Native people, killed them, and collected government payment. Why? Because greed wanted Native land for settlement and resources. Genocide was profitable. You got free land and government bounties for murder. The law authorized and funded this. That's not law serving justice. That's law serving greed through state-sponsored murder. The apprenticeship system enslaved Native children legally. Settlers got free labor. The law made it legal. Greed determined that enslaving children was acceptable if it was profitable, and you called it apprenticeship. The treatment of vulnerable populations proved the title conclusively. Law existed to serve greed, not to protect the vulnerable. Women were trafficked because it was profitable, and law enforcement was bought off. Children were exploited because there was no profit in protecting them. Chinese immigrants were persecuted because discrimination served white economic interests. Mexicans were robbed through legal theft mechanisms. Native Americans were genocided because their death and displacement was profitable. In every case, greed determined outcomes, and law either enabled the greed or was ignored when it interfered with profit. That's not a society run by law. That's a society run by greed wearing law as a costume. The period from 1850 to 1856 in San Francisco represents the absolute nadir of greed-controlled California, where the facade of law completely collapsed and revealed the raw greed beneath. By 1850, San Francisco had grown to 25,000 people with a government that was completely, openly corrupt. The city council was controlled by businessmen who used their positions to grant themselves monopolies, award themselves lucrative contracts, and embezzle public funds. The aldermen would vote themselves ownership of valuable city lands, waterfront property, land grants, anything valuable. They'd award construction contracts to companies they owned. They'd accept bribes openly. The corruption wasn't hidden. It was blatant, public, and nobody could stop it because the entire government was in on it. City funds disappeared into private pockets. Money allocated for public works was stolen. The police and fire departments were underfunded while aldermen got rich. This was greed controlling government completely, using law and office for personal enrichment. Then came the fires. San Francisco burned 6 times between 1849 and 1851, and at least some of these fires were deliberately set by arsonists who profited from the chaos. The arsonists would set fires, then rob people fleeing the flames or loot abandoned buildings. But here, Where greed truly showed. The city government failed to build adequate fire prevention or firefighting infrastructure because doing so would cost money that officials wanted to embezzle. They knew fires were destroying the city repeatedly. They knew thousands of people were losing everything. They didn't care because building fire breaks, funding fire departments, and enforcing fire codes would reduce the money available for corruption. Greed literally let the city burn rather than spend money on public safety. That's not law failing. That's greed deciding that embezzlement was more important than preventing mass destruction. The corrupt government was so blatant that it triggered the Vigilance Committee of 1851, but the vigilantes were motivated by greed as much as the government they opposed. The committee was dominated by businessmen, frustrated that government corruption was harming business and their property values. They weren't fighting for justice or law, they were fighting for their economic interests. When government corruption threatened business, business organized its own extralegal violence to protect its interests. That's just competing greed, not law. The committee hanged several men and drove others out of San Francisco. But they didn't end corruption. They just replaced government corruption with business vigilantism. The fundamental problem remained. Greed, not law, controlled San Francisco. The aftermath showed this clearly. The committee disbanded in 1851, claiming victory. But corruption in city government resumed almost immediately because the underlying problem, that greed controlled politics and law was irrelevant, hadn't changed. By 1856, corruption had gotten so bad again that a second vigilance committee formed. This time they were even more organized. Thousands of armed men, fortified headquarters, their own courts and prisons. They were a parallel government more powerful than the actual government. This was the complete failure of law. The elected government of California's largest city had been replaced by an extra-legal business organization, enforcing its own version of order through military force. That's not law. That's greed organizing its own private government when the official government didn't serve its interests adequately. The 1856 committee hanged 4 men, whipped several, and exiled about 30 others. They controlled San Francisco through force for months, and business supported them because they represented business interests more directly than the corrupt elected government did. When they finally disbanded, they'd proven that law in California meant nothing. Real power belonged to whoever had the most money and the most willingness to use violence to protect their interests. That's greed, not law. But here's the darkest part. The cycle continued. After 1856, the corruption resumed in different forms because the fundamental truth remained unchanged. California was run by greed, and law was just window dressing. The vigilantes hadn't fixed the problem. They just demonstrated that when one greedy interest opposed another, violence determined winners, not law. This period proved the title absolutely. A society actually run by law doesn't experience government collapse and replacement by vigilante business organizations. A society run by law has functioning courts, honest law enforcement, and government that serves public interest. San Francisco had none of these because greed had completely captured every institution. Law existed on paper. In reality, greed determined everything. The difference between early California run by greed and modern California attempting to be run by law is profound and worth examining. Then, government officials openly embezzled public funds and awarded themselves valuable land and contracts. Judges sold verdicts to the highest bidder. Police protected whoever paid them and ignored crimes by the wealthy. Law existed on paper, but was enforced only when profitable or politically advantageous. Now we have ethics laws, oversight boards, audits, and investigative journalism. Officials who embezzle or take bribes face prosecution. Judges who take bribes go to prison. Police corruption exists but is investigated and punished. Law isn't perfect, but there are mechanisms to enforce it even against the powerful. Then basic necessities, water, food, housing, were monopolized and price gouged with no regulation. Merchants formed cartels to fix prices. Companies poisoned water supplies without consequence. There were no consumer protections, no quality standards, no recourse against fraud. Now, we have antitrust laws, consumer protection agencies, health and safety regulation, and courts where consumers can sue for fraud and harm. Markets are regulated. Monopolies are illegal. Companies face consequences for poisoning people or selling defective products. Then, workers had no protections. They could be worked under any conditions, paid any wage, and discarded when injured. Children could be worked in dangerous jobs. There was no workers' compensation, no safety regulation, no legal recourse against abusive employers. Now, we have OSHA, minimum wage laws, workers' compensation, child labor laws, and legal protections that, while imperfect, mean employers face real consequences for violating worker rights. Work is safer, more regulated, and more fair because law actually applies. Then, vulnerable populations, women, children, immigrants, minorities, had almost no legal protections. They could be exploited, trafficked, discriminated against, and even killed with minimal consequences because law didn't protect them. Now, we have civil rights laws, anti-discrimination statutes, human trafficking prosecutions, and constitutional protections. They're imperfectly enforced, but they exist and create real consequences for violations. The vulnerable have legal recourse that they lacked entirely in early California. The difference is that modern California, for all its flaws, has functioning legal institutions that constrain greed. Not perfectly, corruption still exists, wealthy interests still have disproportionate power, and justice is often unequal. But law exists as more than paper. It's enforced. It creates consequences. It constrains behavior in ways that early California never achieved. The progress from greed-run to law-based society didn't happen automatically. It required generations of reformers fighting to create regulatory agencies, anti-corruption laws, civil rights protections, and enforcement mechanisms. It required building institutions that could resist capture by greedy interests. The fact that we have those institutions now, imperfect as they are, is the difference between civilization and the greed-based chaos of early California. Early California was run by greed, not law, and the evidence is overwhelming. Every institution that should have been governed by law, courts, police, government, land ownership, markets, labor relations, was instead controlled by whoever had the most money and the least scruples about how they used it. The law existed on paper. The California Constitution had beautiful language about justice and rights. The statutes promised protections and fair procedures, but in practice, greed determined everything. Judges sold verdicts. Police served paying customers. Officials embezzled public funds. Merchants monopolized necessities and price gouged. Companies poisoned water and worked people to death. The wealthy stole land through corrupt legal processes. The vulnerable were exploited without protection. This wasn't a failure of law, it was law being used as a tool by greed. The legal system functioned exactly as designed by the greedy people who controlled it. They wrote laws to enable their theft and exploitation. They staffed courts with corrupt judges who'd enforce their interests. They captured government and used it for personal enrichment. The people who got rich in early California were overwhelmingly the ones who understood this reality and exploited it. The merchants who monopolized and price gouged. The land speculators who stole Mexican property through corrupt courts. The mining companies that paid off judges and politicians. The officials who embezzled public funds. These people understood that law was theater and greed was reality. Meanwhile, the people who believed in law, who thought hard work and honesty would be rewarded, who trusted that the legal system would protect them, they were crushed. They lost their mining claims to corrupt courts. They went bankrupt paying inflated prices to monopolistic merchants. They were injured and discarded by employers with no legal accountability. They were robbed, cheated, and destroyed while the law did nothing because the law served greed, not justice. The transformation from that greed-run society to modern California took over a century of reform. It required building regulatory agencies that couldn't be easily captured. It required civil service reform to reduce corruption. It required labor laws, consumer protections, civil rights statutes, and environmental regulations. It required creating enforcement mechanisms with real teeth. That progress is real but fragile. The forces of greed still exist and still try to capture government, manipulate law, and use power for private gain. The difference is that modern California has institutional defenses that early California lacked. The greed is constrained, if imperfectly. Remember early California when someone argues for deregulation, for reducing government oversight, for trusting that markets and private interests will self-regulate. Early California is what happens when greed is unconstrained by law. It's not freedom, it's exploitation. It's not prosperity, it's a few getting rich while many suffer. It's not justice, it's whoever has power taking whatever they want. The people who lived through greed-run California, who suffered under corrupt officials and rigged courts and exploitative employers, who watched law fail to protect them while serving the wealthy, they deserve to be remembered not as pioneers in some romantic story, but as victims of a system that valued profit over people and greed over justice. If this story changed how you think about the role of law, regulation, and government in constraining greed and protecting people, share it. Talk about it. Remember it. Because the lessons from early California are still relevant whenever greed tries to capture law for private gain. And if you want to understand how other states built their societies, how other places struggled with the balance between law and greed, between public good and private gain, stick around. Every state has its story, and every story teaches us something about what works and what fails when humans try to build just societies. Thanks for watching.